Late on the 17th February 1943, at Tlemcen in western Algeria, an American brigadier general received an order to move his Marshal Erwin commanded the artillery of the 9th Infantry Division. He had 2,170 men and officers and 411 vehicles. The distance to where he was needed was 735 miles across the Atlas Mountains in February on roads that in places were barely roads. He was not given a deadline because nobody could estimate one. The unit that was supposed to be holding the ground he was ordered to reach had already stopped existing as an organized force. What had happened in Tunisia over the previous 4 days is the worst defeat the United States Army suffered in the European theater in the entire war, measured in ground loss. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had attacked through a gap in the Allied line at Kasserine Pass and driven American units back roughly 50 miles. Behind that pass lay the supply dumps at Tebessa and the road junction at Thala, and behind those lay the possibility of splitting the Allied front in Tunisia in half. American losses came to somewhere above 6,000 men. This was the US Army's first real battle against the German Army, and it lost it. The thing almost nobody tells you about Kasserine is how it stopped. It was not stopped by a counterattack or by a stand at the pass itself. It was stopped at a place called Thala, 30 miles beyond the pass, by artillery that had not been anywhere near the battle 4 days earlier, and by a German divisional commander who made a reasonable decision on the morning of 22nd of February 1943 for reasons that turned non. Erwin's guns covered 735 miles in 100 hours and went into action the following dawn. Hit subscribe now because the barrage those gunners fired on the morning of 22nd February did not destroy the German force in front of them. It did something stranger and more useful than that, and the German commander's own reaction to it is the reason the attack on Thala never happened. Don't go anywhere. To understand why an American army was in that position at all, the story has to go back to the previous November, and to a set of decisions about where to put inexperienced troops and who should command them. To understand Thala, the story has to go back to November 1942, when American troops came ashore in French North Africa and began moving east into Tunisia with almost no combat experience at any level. What happened over the following 3 months set up everything that went wrong in February, and it was not primarily a failure of courage. It started with a doctrine that had never been tested against Germans. It ended with a corps commander running his battle from a headquarters dug into a ravine 70 miles behind the front. By early 1943, the Axis had 2 armies in Tunisia. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim held the north with the newly formed 5th Panzer Army. Rommel, falling back from Libya after El Alamein with Montgomery's 8th Army behind him, held the south at the Mareth line. Between them and the sea lay the Allied front, and along that front the least experienced formations were the American ones. Rommel identified the American sector as the weak point and proposed hitting it before the Allies could concentrate. That assessment was correct, and it was not a difficult one to make. The American positions in the eastern dorsal passes were badly sighted and too widely dispersed. Units were parceled out piecemeal instead of fighting as divisions. Tank destroyers had been designed around a doctrine that expected them to hunt tanks in the open, which turned out to mean being shot at by tanks in the open. The Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had his headquarters dug into a ravine at Tebessa, 70 miles behind the fighting, and had not visited were secret at the times. None of these problems fixed in time. They were simply not fixed in time. On the 14th February 1943, the German attack opened at Sidi Bou Zid. American armor counterattacked at twice open ground into concealed anti-tank guns, and was destroyed both times. Over the following days, American battalions were pushed back more than 50 miles. On 19th February, Rommel committed his main effort through Kasserine Pass itself. On the night of the 20th, the pass was forced. The road to Thala and Tebessa was open, and there was very little organized in front of it. 8 days into its first battle against the German army, The US Second Corps had lost most of its armor in the sector and a great many of its prisoners. What was in front of it was thin. At Thala, 30 miles up the road, Brigadier Charles Dunphy of the British 26th Armoured Brigade fought a delaying action back toward the town with a mixed force of British tanks and infantry, trading vehicles for hours. By the evening of 21 February, he had bought time and had very little left to buy any more with. There were 36 guns supporting the Thala position, against a full panzer division that was not a defence. It was a gesture. Dunphy knew it, and he spent the 21st buying hours he could not otherwise pay for, on the assumption that something would arrive to make the hours worth buying. 4 days earlier, and 735 miles to the west, Erwin's gunners had been ordered onto the road. The 34th Field Artillery Battalion led. Behind it came the 60th Field Artillery, the 60th Cannon Company, the Headquarter Battery, and the 47th Cannon Battalion. They moved out from Tlemcen in Algeria late in the afternoon of 17th February. What they were attempting had no precedent in the US Army's experience in that war, and it was not a road march in any normal sense. It was an attempt to put a divisional artillery train across most of a continent's width of mountain before a battle 3 days' drive away finished without them. A field artillery battalion is not built for speed. It is prime movers towing guns, ammunition trucks, fire direction vehicles, and maintenance sections, and it moves at the pace of its slowest vehicle. The route ran east across the Atlas Mountains on tortuous mountain roads in bitter February weather, with grades that required trucks to be double-banked and stretches where the column could only move in single file. There was no meaningful rest for 4 days. Drivers were changed out inside moving vehicles wherever that could be done at all, and maintenance was carried out on the move or not at all. Anything that broke down badly enough had to be left, because the column could not stop for it. They covered 735 miles in 100 hours. That is an average of a little over 7 miles an hour maintained continuously, day and night for more than 4 days, by 411 vehicles over mountain roads in winter. Some accounts give the distance as 800 miles, and the difference is probably about which start point is being measured from. The 100-hour figure is consistent across the sources. The head of the column reached Thala in the early evening of the 21 February 1943, which was the last evening on which arriving would have made any difference at all. Another 12 hours, and the position they were driving toward would not have been there. There is one further detail that is easy to read past. The 9th Infantry Division's artillery arrived without the 9th Infantry Division. Its 3 infantry regiments were not there and did not come. Divisional artillery is designed to support the division's own infantry, which means Erwin's gunners arrived at Thala as a self-contained artillery force with no infantry of their own to protect them, in front of a panzer division 30 miles beyond a pass that had already been lost. They spent that night getting the guns laid in the dark in the cold after 4 days without sleep, on ground none of them had seen in daylight. By first light on 22nd February, the batteries were surveyed in and ready to fire. That is where the first half of this story ends. Everything to this point is set up. What follows happened inside about 9 hours on the 22nd of February 1943. It is before dawn at Thala. Erwin's battalions have been working through the night in the dark and the cold, surveying positions, laying guns and hauling ammunition off trucks that have been moving for 4 days. By first light, they are ready. Roughly 30 miles behind them is the pass. Directly in front of them is the 10th Panzer Division, which has spent the past 3 days going through everything the Allies have put in its way. Nobody at Thala that morning is confident about what is going to happen. The German plan for that morning was straightforward. General Major Friedrich von Broich, commanding the 10th Panzer Division, intended to attack the Thala position at 7 o'clock. His division had forced the pass, broken a British armoured brigade the previous evening, and had every reason to expect the Allied position in front of it to be as thin as it had been all week. Everything the Germans had seen in Tunisia for 8 days supported that expectation. Nobody on the German side knew that 411 vehicles had arrived from Algeria the previous evening. At first light, the American guns opened. It was a massed barrage from a weight of artillery that had not been present anywhere on that front at any point in the previous week. It did not destroy the 10th Panzer Division. What it did was tell von Breuch something that was not true. A barrage of that weight delivered at dawn is what precedes an attack. He concluded that the Allies were about to counterattack, and that he was about to be hit by a force he had no information about. So he postponed. The attack that was to have gone in at 7 o'clock was pushed back to 4 in the afternoon while he waited to see what was coming. Nothing was coming. There was no counterattack being prepared because there was almost nothing there to counterattack with. What the guns had actually done was buy 9 hours of daylight, which is the single most valuable commodity available to anyone on that battlefield, and hand it to the side that had air superiority. Von Breuch was not being timid. He was doing what a competent commander does when a new and unexplained weight of fire appears in front of him overnight, which is to find out what it means before committing. Those 9 hours were spent, from the German point of view, in the open in daylight in February 1943 in Tunisia, within range of Allied air. American P-38s worked the German positions and columns through the afternoon. The British 26th Armoured Brigade put in a counterattack of its own around the middle of the day, which was thrown back with the loss of the 5 tanks that actually reached the German line. The American guns kept firing. When von Breuch finally attacked at 4 o'clock, it went in against a position that had been reinforced, registered, and worked on all day by an enemy that now knew exactly where he was. The attack failed. Most of the tanks committed to it were lost. It took a long time to get this one straight, because most accounts of Kasserine end at the pass and treat what happened afterwards as a footnote. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. One like, nothing more. At about 2:15 on the afternoon of the 22nd of February 1943, Field Marshal Rommel concluded that the offensive had failed and ordered a withdrawal from both Kasserine and Spieber. The decision was made before von Breuch's postponed attack even went in, which is to say that the Battle of Thala was decided in the mind of the German commander, in front of it several hours before anything else happened. Rommel's reasons were not only Thala. He was overextended on a supply line that could not sustain the advance. He was short of fuel and ammunition. Allied air power over the battlefield was increasing daily, and Montgomery's 8th Army was closing on the Marath line behind him, held at that moment by little more than a screen of Italian infantry. Any one of those would have argued for stopping. What Thala did was remove the last reason to continue, which was the belief that there was nothing solid left in front of him. The withdrawal was conducted so competently that the Allies did not realize for some time that it had happened. By 25th February, the Axis forces were back on the lines they had started from on the 18th. American troops reoccupied Kasserine Pass and took several hundred Italian prisoners. In territorial terms, the battle had achieved nothing for either side. In every other respect, it had achieved a great deal, and almost all of that landed on the American side of the ledger over the following 6 weeks. An army that has been beaten and knows exactly why is a more dangerous thing than an army that has never been tested. Here is what it cost. American casualties at Kasserine are usually given as more than 6,000, with figures of around 300 killed and roughly 3,000 taken prisoner appearing in different accounts, and the totals genuinely vary between sources. Axis casualties were around 2,000. It remains, in ground surrendered, the largest reverse the US Army suffered against the Germans in the Second World War. Whole units were destroyed. Equipment losses in armor were severe enough that the 1st Armored Division had to be substantially rebuilt. None of those numbers changed hands back when the ground did. What it brought was a reckoning that happened quickly. Fredendall was relieved of corps on the 6th of March 1943 and sent home. George Patton took the corps and had 11 days to prepare it before its next action. Tank destroyer doctrine was rewritten. Units stopped being parceled out by battalion and started fighting as divisions. Air-ground coordination was reorganized from the top. 2.5 months after Kasserine, the Axis position in North Africa collapsed entirely, and roughly 250,000 Axis troops went into captivity in Tunisia. There is an honest footnote here, and it cuts both ways. The 9th Division's artillery did not win the Battle of Kasserine Pass on its own, and no serious account claims it did. Dunphy's British armour bought the time for it to arrive and paid for that time in tanks. The stand at Speber held the northern route. Rommel's logistics were failing, regardless. The guns were the last item in a list, not the whole list. What is fair to say is that they were the item that convinced the German commander in front of Thala that the list was longer than it was. It is also worth being careful about the word victory. Kasserine was a defeat. American units were overrun, a corps commander was relieved, and more than 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in an operation that ended with both sides back where they started. The best short account of all of it is Rick Atkinson's An Army at Dawn, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History and does not soften any of it. The interesting thing about Kasserine is not that the army lost, it is what it did in the 6 weeks after. Brigadier General Stafford Leroy Irwin came home. He went on to command the 5th Infantry Division through France and Germany, and later commanded a corps. The 2,170 men and 411 vehicles that left Tlemcen on the 17th February 1943 are recorded in the 9th Infantry Division's own history as one of 2 great feats of American artillery in the Second World War. Kasserine Pass is still there, on the road between Spitler and Thala in west-central Tunisia, and it looks today very much as it did in the photographs from 1943. So does the road north to Thala, which is the road the guns came down. Official records can tell us which units crossed North Africa and where they fought. Only families can tell us who those servicemen truly were. If your father, grandfather, uncle, or another relative took part in the North African campaign, regardless of branch or unit, share a piece of his life in the comments. Include his name, then add something military roster could preserve, a deed, a phrase he repeated, or a memory passed down through your family. It might be his battalion, the gun returned to, the hometown he finally returned to, or the job waiting for him after the war. These personal details rescue a life from the silence of an archive. The men who served there should be remembered not simply as names and numbers, but as people. Subscribe and return for the next account. This history still holds many stories worth telling.